The day my brother broke my life wasn't some ordinary day. It was the kind of day that sears itself into your bones. The kind you can't forget no matter how many years pass or how much forgiveness you try to force into your heart. My name's James Cole, and for 52 years I believed that family was unbreakable. I believed that blood meant loyalty, that no matter how hard life got, you could always turn to your brother and find a friend, not an enemy. But that belief and that fragile, beautiful lie was shattered in one night of flashing red and blue lights, cold rain, and betrayal that cut deeper than any blade could. I can still see it clearly, the rain dripping down from the edge of my workshop roof, the smell of wet wood and motor oil hanging thick in the air. The sheriff's car pulled up, tires crunching over the gravel, the lights spinning like a cruel carnival, red and blue reflecting off every puddle. I stood there frozen, wiping my hands on my work apron, not understanding what was happening. I'd just finished fixing up an old pickup for a client, a man who'd trusted me for 20 years. When I saw the deputies step out, their expressions stiff and rehearsed. One of them carried a stack of papers wrapped in plastic to protect them from the rain. "James Cole?" he asked, though he already knew who I was. "Yeah," I said slowly, my voice uncertain. "What's going on?" And that's when the world tilted. He read out words I'd never thought could belong to me. Fraud, theft, deception. Words that burned as they left his mouth. I remember feeling my knees go weak, my hands trembling as I tried to speak, but my tongue felt heavy, useless. They said my business had been laundering money, that I'd been stealing from clients, cooking the books, lying about sales. I laughed at first, not out of humor but disbelief. I thought it was a mistake, a mix-up, something that could be explained. But then I saw the name on the complaint, Ethan Cole, my own brother. That moment. It was like hearing your heartbeat stop while you're still alive. Ethan and I had grown up sharing everything. One room, one dream, one family. He was the charming one, the talker. I was the worker. He could sell an idea before it even existed, and people loved him for it. But charm is a dangerous weapon when it's in the wrong hands. It hides greed well, and he'd learned to use it like a knife. Smiling as he twisted it, he'd come to me months before, saying he had a plan, a business expansion, an investment opportunity that could take our workshop to the next level. He spoke with that same easy confidence he'd always had, convincing me that together we could build something bigger, something lasting. I trusted him, not because his idea made sense, but because he was my brother. And when you've spent your life protecting someone, you don't expect them to stab you in the back while you're holding the door open for them. The truth, I later learned, was simple and brutal. Ethan had used my signature, forged it, to funnel money through my company, pocketing thousands in fake transactions. When the heat came down, he didn't flinch. He handed them my name, said I'd been running the whole thing behind his back. And just like that, everything I'd built, 30 years of sweat, sacrifice, and reputation, went up in smoke. I remember standing there in the rain, clutching those papers, my reflection swimming in the puddles at my feet. I looked up at the night sky, and I swear it felt like even God had turned his back on me. The deputies drove away, and I was left in silence. No words, no defenses, just the sound of my own breath and the cold truth settling in. Neighbors watched from their windows. Some whispered. Others just closed their curtains. I didn't blame them. In a small town, reputation is everything. And mine had just been dragged through the mud. The next morning, my clients stopped answering calls. My landlord sent a notice. Friends I'd known for decades crossed the street to avoid me. And through it all, Ethan stayed silent. Not a call, not a visit, nothing. The hardest part wasn't the loss of money or even the business. It was knowing that the person I would have died for didn't even flinch when he destroyed me. It was realizing that every childhood memory, every laugh, every shared secret meant nothing to him. But here's the thing about losing everything. It strips you bare. And when you're standing in the ashes of your old life, you see the truth clearer than ever. I saw who Ethan really was and who I had become by trusting him blindly. I lost my home, my workshop, my name. For months I lived in the back of my old truck, parked behind what used to be my business. Every morning I watched the sun rise over that empty lot. And every night I promised myself one thing, that this wouldn't be the end of me. Because what Ethan didn't know was that I wasn't the kind of man who stayed broken. I was the kind of man who rebuilt, quietly, patiently, piece by piece. And someday I swore he'd look me in the eye and realize the price of his betrayal. That night and the night my brother broke my life and was also the night I began to take it back. Maple Ridge wasn't the kind of town you ever really left behind. Even if you drove far away, some part of you stayed tangled in its roots. It was a quiet little place tucked between pine-covered hills and the slow hum of sawmills, where the air smelled like rain and fresh-cut wood. A town so small you could drive through it in 5 minutes, but somehow still get lost in all its stories. The sign by the highway read, "Welcome to Maple Ridge, and where neighbors are family." Back then, I actually believed that. That's where Ethan and I grew up. Two brothers who couldn't have been more different, but were bound by the same blood and the same man who taught us how to work with our hands and stand on our word. Our dad, Thomas Cole, was a logger, a man built from oak and silence. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words stuck like nails. He'd come home every night covered in sawdust and sap, boots heavy with mud, hands cracked and scarred from years of gripping an axe. Yet somehow his touch was gentle when he'd pat us on the shoulder and say, "A man's name is his promise, boys. Don't ever break it." Those words meant everything to me. I think Ethan heard them too, but he never really listened. When Dad passed, I was 23 and Ethan was 21. I remember the day the will was read. We sat on the porch of the old house, the wind whispering through the trees, the scent of cedar thick in the air. The lawyer handed me the papers, 5 acres of land, the house we grew up in, and Dad's old workshop still filled with tools that hummed with history. It wasn't much by city standards, but to me it was everything. It was home. It was legacy. Ethan stared out at the trees with that restless look in his eyes, the same one he'd had since we were kids. "This town's too small for me," he said, his voice low but sure. "I can't spend my life surrounded by trees and sawdust." I smiled, even though it hurt a little. "Someone's got to keep the place running," I told him. He laughed. "Then that someone can be you, big brother." And just like that, he was gone. He left for Portland first, then Seattle, chasing dreams that had dollar signs written all over them. The first few months, he'd call every other week, telling me about city lights, business deals, and people who wore suits worth more than Dad's truck. He sounded happy, confident, alive. And I was happy for him. I really was. Because not everyone's built for small-town life. Some folks need noise and movement, while others, like me, find peace in the quiet rhythm of a hammer striking wood. So I stayed. I kept the workshop running, fixing fences, crafting tables, carving names into rocking chairs for new families that moved into town. I called the place Cole's Custom Woodworks. It started as a humble setup, one workbench, a few old tools, and Dad's picture hanging above the doorway. But it grew. Word spread, jobs rolled in, and before long I had more work than I could handle. Folks from all around, even from the next county, started bringing their orders to me, not because I was the cheapest, but because I was honest. And in Maple Ridge, that still meant something. Every board I planned, every joint I fitted, it all felt like a conversation with Dad. I could almost hear his voice when I worked late into the night, sawdust clinging to my shirt, the smell of pine thick in the air. "Keep it straight, James, don't cut corners." He'd always said that. Meanwhile, Ethan became a ghost that drifted in and out of my life. Sometimes he'd call out of the blue full of stories about fancy cars, expensive dinners, and people who promised him the world. Other times he'd vanish for months, leaving nothing but silence. But whenever he did show up, usually unannounced, usually broke, I never turned him away. He'd drive up the old dirt road, dust trailing behind his shiny car, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'd see him step out in his city clothes, clean shoes, slick hair, looking like he didn't belong anymore, but pretending he did. And every time I'd pour him a beer, slap him on the back, and say, "Welcome home, brother." Because that's what family does, right? We forgive. We remember the good parts. We pretend not to see the cracks. He'd talk big, about new deals, big breaks, investments that were just about to blow up. I'd listen, nodding along, even though I didn't understand half of it. While I talked about fixing a barn or building a porch swing, he talked about returns and shares and capital. We were from the same blood, but different worlds. Still, I admired his confidence and the way he made life sound like a game he was always winning. Sometimes, when the night got late and the beer ran low, I'd catch a glimpse of the old Ethan, the boy who used to fish with me by the creek, who'd sneak into Dad's truck and pretend we were going cross-country. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But then he'd check his phone, sigh, and say he had to leave. He always had somewhere else to be, and me. I'd just watch the taillights disappear down the road, swallowed by the dark. Then I'd walk back into the workshop, where the air still smelled of cedar and oil, and remind myself that at least one of us was keeping the dream alive. Years rolled by like that, slow and steady, like the turning of seasons. Maple Ridge didn't change much. The same families, the same gossip, the same familiar faces at the diner. My business thrived quietly, and I built a life I was proud of. Not glamorous, but honest. And every so often, I'd get a call from Ethan promising to visit, always with some new idea or plan he wanted to share. And each time he said, "I've got something big coming, James. This could be it." I believed him. Because no matter how many times he left, no matter how many times he disappointed me, he was still my brother. And brothers, I thought, don't let each other fall. I didn't know then that the dreams he was chasing would one day come crashing straight through mine. That the same hands I used to pull him out of trouble would be the ones he'd later use to push me under. Back then, all I knew was love, loyalty, and the naive kind of faith that only family can blind you with. Because when you grow up side by side with someone, share the same meals, the same laughter, the same grief, you don't expect that one day, that same person will become the reason you lose everything. That was our beginning. Two brothers, one dream. But dreams, I would learn, can rot from the inside, especially when one heart starts to crave more than what the other can give. It was one of those mornings when the sky looks like dull metal. No color, no light, just a heavy stillness that sits on your chest and refuses to move. The kind of morning that makes the air smell of rain even before it falls. I remember that day because it was the first time in a long while I'd seen Ethan's face in person. The last I'd heard from him had been a short call 6 months earlier. Something about a new deal, a new life, a new version of himself. That was always his pattern. Disappear, then reappear, carrying the smell of expensive cologne and promises that sounded like music until you realized the tune never ended the same way it started. That September morning, I was standing outside the workshop, sanding down the edge of a walnut table, when I heard the hum of an engine that didn't belong on our road. My first thought was that it must have been one of the realtors from town, the ones who liked to drive up and ask if I'd ever thought about selling a piece of the land. But when the black SUV came into view, shining even under the gray light, I knew exactly who it was. Ethan stepped out, sunglasses on, suit pressed sharp as a blade, and a grin plastered across his face like he owned the place. He looked older, but not in a way that time makes you older. More like success had aged him in all the wrong ways. His hair was trimmed close, his watch gleamed in the weak sunlight, and he walked with that same restless energy I remembered from when we were kids, like every second he wasn't talking was a second wasted. "James," he said, spreading his arms like he was greeting an old friend, not a brother he hadn't seen in over a year. "Damn, it's good to see you." I wiped my hands on my work apron and managed a small smile. "Didn't think the city let folks out this far anymore," I said. He laughed, that same easy, charming laugh that used to win people over when we were young. But underneath it, I caught something else, calculation. Ethan didn't come home just to catch up. He never did. We sat on the porch just like old times. He declined the coffee I offered. Kian said he was trying to cut back. Instead, he talked. And when Ethan talked, he didn't just speak, he performed. His voice had rhythm, his eyes sparkled. His words painted pictures you couldn't help but step into. "James," he started, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "You've been running this workshop for what, 25 years now?" 30, I corrected. He nodded like he already knew. "And you've built a hell of a name for yourself. People love what you do. But be honest, big brother. How much can you really make building tables and fixing porches for people who haggle over $50? I said nothing. I didn't like where this was going, but I let him talk. He always needed to feel like he was leading the dance. "That land Dad left us," he said, gesturing toward the trees beyond the house. "It's worth a fortune. James, the city folks, they're coming out here every summer, renting cabins, paying stupid money just to get away. Rustic charm, they call it," he chuckled. "You've already got the wood, the space, the skill. I've got the investors, the marketing, the capital. We could turn this whole place into a luxury retreat. Coal cabins. Think about it. People would pay thousands to stay here. You'd handle construction. I'd handle financing. We'd split it, 60-40. You get more because you'll be on site. It's fair. I stared at him, not sure what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh. The idea sounded so absurd. Strangers staying in Dad's woods, drinking wine on decks where he used to stack lumber. That land wasn't just dirt and trees. It was memory. It was where he taught us to use a hammer, where we built our first fort, where we buried Mom's old garden tools after she died because we couldn't stand to look at them anymore. To me, it was sacred ground. Ethan, I said quietly, that land's not just property. It's home. He waved his hand like he was swatting away a fly. Home? James, it's wasted potential. You've been sitting on a gold mine for years and you don't even know it. Dad wouldn't want it rotting away under pine needles. He'd want us to make something out of it. I hated when he said that, when he used Dad's name like a key to unlock my doubts. He knew exactly how to press where it hurt. Still, I told him I needed time to think. And he didn't push, not that day. Instead, he stayed for dinner. We grilled steaks out back, drank a few beers, and for a few hours it almost felt like the old days. He told stories about his partners, men with firm handshakes and sharper teeth, and about how he'd learned the art of the deal. I watched him talk, wondering when he'd stopped being my brother and started becoming someone I barely recognized. But he had that way about him. That light. Even when you knew he was playing you, it was hard not to get pulled in. Over the next week, he stayed in town. He'd drop by the workshop, lend a hand, chat with the locals. Everyone loved him, as always. They'd say, "That Ethan, he's got big ideas," and I'd just nod, trying to ignore the unease that kept growing in my gut. At night, I'd sit on the porch staring at the tree line, hearing Dad's voice echo in my head. A man's name is his promise. Ethan's promises had always come wrapped in gold paper and ended in ashes. But I told myself maybe this time was different. Maybe he'd changed. Maybe he was really trying to build something with me, not just for me. So when he came back one morning with a stack of papers and that same confident grin, I gave in. We sat at the kitchen table, and he slid the documents toward me. Partnership terms, licensing agreements, profit breakdowns. He talked fast, smooth, assuring me everything was by the book. 60-40, he said again, tapping the paper with his pen. You handle construction, I handle the money. Just like we agreed. I hesitated, the pen in my hand trembling slightly. The land meant everything to me, every inch of it a memory. But I thought of what he said. Dad would want us to build something out of it, and so I signed. We shook hands, the same way we used to when we were kids building tree forts out of old lumber and scrap nails. Only this time it wasn't childhood dreams we were stacking. It was trust, laid out like kindling, waiting for one spark to burn it all down. He smiled, that wide, dazzling smile that could sell hope to a drowning man. You won't regret this, James, he said, gripping my hand tight. But even as our hands met, I felt something shift inside me, something small, cold, and uncertain. Like the air right before a storm breaks. I didn't know it then, but I wasn't shaking hands with my brother. I was shaking hands with my ruin. The betrayal didn't happen all at once. It didn't come with thunder or sirens or some dramatic fight. It came quietly and on paper and ink in the space between trust and deceit. It came the way poison does, slow, subtle, almost invisible, until it's too late to stop it. I remember the day the documents arrived. It was early winter, the kind of Oregon morning where the fog sits low and heavy, curling through the trees like a living thing. The workshop was warm from the fire in the stove, the smell of pine shavings thick in the air. I was finishing up a cedar cabinet for a client when Ethan's lawyer came by. A young guy in a gray suit, polite but rehearsed, holding a sleek leather briefcase that looked out of place against the sawdust-covered floor. "Mr. Cole," he said, offering a practiced smile, "I'm representing your brother Ethan in formalizing the business agreement you two discussed. He asked me to drop these off personally." He opened the briefcase, laid out a stack of papers so thick it could have been a novel, and began flipping through them as if I had the faintest idea what I was looking at. Ethan had mentioned something about needing, to make it official, about setting up a proper company name so investors would feel comfortable. I remember feeling proud that we were finally doing something together, that maybe, after all the years apart, we'd built something that could last. I didn't understand much of the language, but I trusted my brother. I didn't need to understand every word. I understood him, or at least I thought I did. Later that day, Ethan stopped by wearing that same confidence-like armor. He found me in the workshop, sleeves rolled up, glasses perched on my nose, staring at the maze of clauses and signatures. "Jimmy," he said with that easy grin, the one that always softened me, "you don't need to overthink it. It's all standard stuff. Liability, property structure, financing terms, legal mumbo-jumbo that makes sure everything's clean." I frowned. "You sure about this? There's a lot in here I don't get." He laughed, slapping my shoulder like he used to when we were boys. "That's why I've got lawyers, big brother. I've done this before. You just focus on the building part. I'll handle the boring paperwork." And just like that, I let my guard down. I signed where he told me to sign. Page after page, my name scrawled across the fine print, my trust flowing from the pen like blood from an open wound. Every signature felt like a promise, that we were finally partners, that Dad's legacy would live on, that family still meant something. I didn't know I was signing away the very thing I was trying to protect. When it was done, Ethan smiled wide and clapped his hands. "That's it," he said. "Now we're official." We went out for beers that night. He toasted to the future, and I remember feeling something I hadn't felt in years, hope. Maybe this was what Dad meant when he said brothers should build together. Maybe Ethan had finally come home for good, but 3 months later everything started to unravel. It was a Thursday morning when my phone rang. I was in the middle of cutting oak planks when I saw the caller ID, Maple Ridge Bank. The woman on the other end spoke in that careful, formal tone bankers use when they're about to ruin your day. "Mr. Cole," she said, "we're calling to inform you that your business accounts have been temporarily frozen due to a change in ownership documentation." I blinked, not understanding. "A what?" "There's been a transfer of title," she continued. "The assets under Cole's Custom Woodworks in the adjoining land parcel are now registered to Cole Enterprises, LLC. Ethan Cole, listed as sole proprietor." Her words didn't register at first. It felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me. That's impossible," I stammered. "There's been a mistake." But there was no mistake. In a few cold legal sentences, everything I owned, the workshop, the tools, the land my father left behind, had been stripped out from under me. My inheritance, my livelihood, my home, all transferred into the name of a company I didn't even know existed until that moment. And the signature on the transfer papers, mine. When I drove to town that afternoon, I must have broken a dozen speed limits. The whole way there, I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Ethan wouldn't do this. Not him, not my brother. Maybe it was a mix-up, maybe his lawyer messed up the paperwork. Something, anything other than what it looked like. I found him standing outside a cafe downtown, leaning against his SUV, dressed like he'd just come from a board meeting. He smiled when he saw me, actually smiled. "Jimmy," he said, pushing off the car. "Didn't expect to see you today." I threw the paperwork onto the hood between us. "What the hell is this, Ethan?" He barely looked down. "Looks like business documents." "Don't play games with me," I said, my voice shaking. "You used me. You forged this company to steal everything Dad left us. My land, my workshop, everything." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Jimmy, calm down. It's not theft. It's business. You signed the papers. You gave me control." "Control?" My chest felt like it was on fire. "You told me it was a partnership." "It is," he said, grinning that smug, polished grin that made me want to hit him. "Just not the kind you thought." I took a step closer, my hands trembling. "You lied to me," he shrugged. "I did what I had to do. You don't understand how the world works, brother. You're stuck in this small-town mindset. Loyalty, honesty, trust. That's not how business is done. You think Dad's old land was some sacred relic. I see opportunity, profit, growth. You were sitting on potential, and I made it real." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The boy who once spent summer nights building tree forts beside me, who laughed so hard he cried when we accidentally set fire to Dad's shed roof. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man I didn't recognize. "You stole from me," I said quietly. He tilted his head, almost pitying. "I won, Jimmy, that's what you don't get. You signed. You agreed. You were too trusting, too sentimental, and now you're mad because I played smarter." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind blew across the parking lot, carrying the faint smell of rain and exhaust. Then Ethan smiled. Not a brother's smile, but a predator's. Business is business. "Jimmy," he said, leaning casually against his car, "you should have read the fine print." That was the moment something inside me broke. Something small but essential. Something that had always believed that blood was thicker than greed. I stood there staring at him, my hands trembling, my heart pounding. Every memory we'd ever shared flashing before my eyes. The fishing trips, the birthdays, the long nights fixing Dad's truck under the porch light. It all felt like a lie now, like scenes from someone else's life. When I finally spoke, my voice came out hollow. "You're not my brother anymore," he smirked, slid into his SUV, and said before closing the door, "Never mix family with business, Jimmy. It's messy." And just like that, he drove away, tires hissing against wet asphalt, taillights glowing red like embers fading into the fog. I stood there until the rain started to fall, cold and sharp, soaking through my shirt, washing the sawdust off my hands. The same hands that had built everything he'd just taken away. That was the day I learned that betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it wears your last name. Sometimes it smiles while it ruins you, and sometimes it drives away without looking back. The months that followed Ethan's betrayal weren't just hard, they were hollow. They felt like living inside a life that had already burned down, walking through the ashes pretending it was still home. Everything I had built, the workshop, the reputation, the quiet pride of an honest man's work, was gone, not by fire or accident, but by the hands of the one person I'd trusted most. The news of what happened spread through Maple Ridge faster than wildfire through dry pine. At first it was whispers, cautious, uncertain. Folks who'd known me for decades gave me tight smiles and half-hearted greetings. Then came the side glances, the muttered talk behind coffee cups at the diner, the sudden quiet whenever I walked into the hardware store. You could feel the shift, that invisible turning of the crowd, like the tide pulling away before a storm. And then came the stories. Ethan told anyone who would listen that I'd stolen from him, that I was the reason our partnership had fallen apart. According to him, I'd taken investor money and mismanaged it, spent it on personal expenses, sabotaged our business to keep him from expanding. Lies, every word of it. But when lies come dressed in confidence and a suit, people believe them faster than they believe a man with dirt under his nails. He was smooth, always had been. He made himself the victim, the ambitious younger brother betrayed by the older one who couldn't handle success. And me? I was painted as the jealous, bitter craftsman who'd turned to fraud when I couldn't keep up. The worst part was that the story made sense to them. People like simple stories, and Ethan, the smart businessman, versus James, the bitter brother, was an easy one to believe. Clients stopped calling. Longtime customers, the same folks whose barns I'd repaired, whose kitchen tables I'd built by hand, started avoiding me. I'd walk into the general store and hear the silence shift like a door closing. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about trust, and once that was gone, there was nothing left to stand on. Then one morning I saw the sheriff's truck pull into my driveway. Sheriff Miller had been my father's friend once. We'd eaten at the same table, shared stories about hunting trips and local politics. But when he stepped out that day, his face was all business. He held a paper in his hand, a warrant. "James," he said quietly, "we've got to look into some financial irregularities." Ethan's filed a formal complaint. I just stood there, my hands still covered in sawdust. "You know me, Miller," I said, voice breaking. "You know I didn't do this." He sighed, eyes heavy with something that looked a lot like pity. "Just let us do our job, son." And so I watched as they went through my workshop, the same workshop Dad built with his own two hands. They opened drawers, took photos, boxed up paperwork, computer drives, even old invoices. Years of my life reduced to folders and evidence bags. They even took Dad's old ledger, the one he used to write down payments from neighbors back in the logging days. I tried to tell them it was just memories, just numbers from another life, but they didn't listen. The law doesn't have room for sentiment. When they were done, the place looked gutted. Empty shelves, bare walls, dust settling where my tools used to hang. My father's hammer, the one with the worn wooden handle, sat on the edge of the bench. I picked it up, held it in my hands for a long time, and for the first time since I was a boy, I cried. After that, everything fell apart fast. The bank froze my remaining accounts. My credit tanked. The bills stacked up. Without my business, I had no income. Without income, I had no way to fight the legal battles Ethan had set in motion. My lawyer, a young kid from Portland who meant well but didn't stand a chance against Ethan's legal team, told me straight, "He's got everything tied up in his company's name. You signed over controlling interest. Legally, it's airtight." That phrase, legally airtight, became the coffin lid on everything I had left. Within weeks, I was evicted. The land that had been in our family for 3 generations, the place where Dad taught us how to swing an axe, where Mom planted daisies by the fence, where Ethan and I carved our initials into the old oak, was gone. I tried to fight it, but every door closed in my face. In the end, I packed what little I had into my old Chevy truck, the same one Dad rebuilt when we were kids, and drove away. I didn't even look back when I passed the workshop. I couldn't. Seeing it empty would have killed me. I ended up parking behind Ruby's diner, the same place Mom used to take us after church when we were little. She'd always order us pancakes with extra syrup and tell us to save room for sweetness. Funny how life turns those same places into ghosts of better times. The owner, Ruby's daughter, still ran the place. She must have seen me sitting there through the window one night because she came out with a cup of coffee and a sandwich. "Rough night, James?" she asked softly. I nodded but couldn't speak. She didn't press. She just left the food on the hood and said, "You always were one of the good ones. Don't let this town forget that." I ate that sandwich like it was the first meal I'd had in days, and maybe it was. For weeks, that truck became my home. I'd park by the diner, sometimes down by the river when I needed quiet. I used an old blanket from the workshop to keep warm, and I kept Dad's hammer on the dashboard, a reminder that I was still his son, even if everything else was gone. Every night I'd lie back and stare at the stars. Some nights the sky was so clear it looked like glass, the kind you could almost touch if you reached out far enough. And I'd whisper the same thing over and over again, not to Ethan, not to the world, but to Dad. "Dad, I swear. I'll make it right." I didn't know how yet. I didn't have a plan, or a dollar, or a place to call my own. But I had that promise, that one thin thread tying me to who I used to be. Because even when a man loses everything, his home, his name, his pride, and he still has his word, and that night, under a sky that didn't care who was right or wrong, I gave my word to the only man who ever taught me what it meant to keep one. I didn't know it then, but losing everything wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something darker, something that would test just how much of myself I still had left to lose. When everything you thought was solid turns to dust, you either let it bury you or you learn to sift through the grit until you find something worth holding. I learned that on my hands and knees with splinters in my fingertips and the taste of metal on my tongue. I was broke, humiliated, and hollowed out by the kind of shame that made your bones ache. But there was a stubbornness in me that refused to be put down. I wasn't done, not by a long shot. The new place was nothing like the workshop Dad left us. It was a rented shed on the edge of town, one of those tin-roofed boxes with a single flickering light bulb and a dirt floor that chewed through the soles of your boots. The landlord called it temporary. I called it home. I brought in a battered workbench, a couple of boxes of nails, and the few tools that hadn't been taken as evidence: a chisel with a nick in the blade, a handsaw that smelled faintly of cedar, and Dad's old hammer which I kept wrapped in a rag because it felt sacrilegious to lay it on a bare shelf. I worked like a man with the last of his pride strapped to his back. Days blurred into the next, dawn tipping the horizon in cold blue, the heater sputtering in the shed, my breath making small clouds in front of me as I planed wood until the pile of shavings looked like snow. I took any job that came my way: a sagging fence in Mr. Hargrove's pasture, a broken step at the church, a kitchen table for a young couple expecting their first child. Sometimes the pay was a few dollars and a quiet thank you passed across a porch. Sometimes it was a pot of stew and a plate of biscuits. Money was scarce, but work was honest, and honest work was its own kind of currency when the rest of the world had turned away. My hands paid the price. Blisters whose skins peeled back like old paint, splinters embedded stubbornly under the nail of my index finger that I refused to pull out because the pain reminded me I was alive and moving. The first winter in the shed, my back screamed every night and I slept in a curled knot on a foam pad, the hammer within reach like a talisman. I would wake, drink black coffee that tasted like burnt rope, and head out before the sun could warm the road. When your life is reduced to the rhythm of work, you find small certainties. The way a dovetail fits when cut right, the steadiness of a straight edge, the satisfying ring of a well-driven nail. One evening, when the light had slimmed to an indigo hush and I was sweeping shavings that clung to the floor like old ghosts, a car pulled into the shed lot. I almost didn't notice the figure until she stood in the doorway framed by the warm wash of the streetlight. Martha Green had been one of my first customers when I opened Cole's Custom Woodworks. She was the kind of woman who kept her hair pinned tight and wore aprons with pockets full of candy for kids who stopped by. Martha wasn't flashy. She was the kind of faithful person who'd shown up with a pot of soup when my father got sick and had quietly left coin under the prayer book at church more than once. "James," she said, and there was no small talk in her voice, just that simple, solid name like a rope thrown to the drowning. "I don't care what they say about you. You're the most honest man I know." For a second, I let myself breathe. Then she continued, "Build me a porch. Make it strong. Make it right. And I'll tell everyone you're still the best carpenter in Oregon." I wanted to argue that she didn't have to put herself out like that I could manage, that I didn't need favors. But the truth was, an honest commission from someone who still believed in me felt like being handed a life preserver. I told her I'd start in the morning. The porch wasn't fancy. It was a stout, honest thing made of reclaimed cedar and oak salvaged from a torn-down barn. I worked on it with a kind of reverence, cutting boards to fit like pieces of a puzzle, smoothing edges until they were warm to the touch. Martha came by some afternoons, hands on her hips, watching like a proud parent. She brought a thermos of lemonade and a loaf of bread and told stories that made me laugh so hard, sawdust fell from my beard. When she finally stood on the finished steps and ran her hand along the railing, I watched her face, that quiet smile, and something inside me unclenched. Word has its own slow miracle. Martha kept her promise. She stood at the front of the church the next Sunday and found the right moment to mention it. Not loudly, not to attack anyone, but with the kind of plain authority she'd always had. "If you need a man to build you something that will last," she said, "go see James Cole." It traveled by word of mouth the way wildflowers seed a field. One woman told another. A neighbor mentioned it at the feed store. A landscaper tipped his hat as he passed my shed. The calls came like springs of fresh water in a drought. Modest jobs at first, but honest ones. A porch, then a set of shutters, then a barn door patched when a storm had torn through Mr. Larkin's field. Each job brought a small check, a steady rhythm, the kind of daily bread that filled a hollow with something real. Work rebuilt me in ways I hadn't expected. There were nights when I sat on the tailgate of my truck after a day's labor and watched the town light up like a cluster of secrets. I'd think about the men who'd once called me a thief and feel a hot coil of anger in my gut. But mostly I felt quieter things. The slow rebuilding of faith in myself, the gratitude for the people who had refused to let me rot, and the growing knowledge that I could still do what my hands had always known how to do. Every nail I hammered carried a vow, quiet, dangerous, and private. I didn't speak of it outwardly. I didn't plan schemes or threats. My promise kept itself in the measured weight of my work, that Ethan would one day face the truth of what he'd done. Not because I wanted him hurt, but because a man who destroys another with a smile should not live in peace. That justice, I believed, would come not from my teeth, but from the world eventually balancing its books. In the meantime, I would keep building. There were small victories that tasted like salvation. A steady client who needed a dining set for his daughter's wedding. A local paper that ran a short piece about the new porch on Main Street that included my name. The sheriff, the same man who'd once held a warrant, tipping his hat when he saw me and offering a curt, "Good to see you working." It didn't erase the past, but it stitched new seams into the fabric of my days. Slowly, things changed. My hands grew calloused again, but in a different way. Not raw with desperation, but weathered by purpose. My savings, such as they were, padded out. My nights in the truck became less frequent. I found a small room above Mr. Jonas's feed store, high and tight and smelling of hay, where I kept my tools and a single photograph of Dad that I'd carried in my pocket for months. Standing there, with the rain drumming on the tin roof and the faint glow of the town below, I let myself believe in something I hadn't in a long time, that a life could be rebuilt from dust. If you are willing to dig and plant and wait, rebuilding isn't a clean arc. It's a grind, a succession of tiny, stubborn acts. It's apologizing and earning trust. It's learning to take a compliment without flinching, and to accept help when it comes from unexpected hands. It's letting the wounds close while keeping the scar as a map. And through it all, I held to the promise I'd whispered into the night by the river. One day, truth would find its way back to the surface. For now, I kept carving, sanding and nailing one piece at a time, and with every finished plank, I felt a little more of the man I used to be return. Stronger, quieter, and far more dangerous in his resolve than he'd ever been when he was simply naive. I'll be honest, for a long time after the fall, revenge wasn't on my radar. I wanted quiet. I wanted to rebuild my life in slow, respectable pieces and tuck the whole thing away like a bruise that healed without a scar. But grief has a way of turning into something else when you let it sit. That something else for me was righteous anger, braided with a stubborn need for truth. When I heard that Ethan had started using my name again, this time to dupe investors out of real money, to use Dad's memory as a seal and my reputation as bait, something in me snapped like an old rope. I couldn't let him keep walking around with that smile, taking people's lives apart and leaving nothing but smoke. So I stopped imagining myself as a quiet, pained carpenter and started thinking like a man who needed a plan, not because I wanted to watch him suffer, but because a man who forges signatures and sells lies for profit shouldn't get to sleep at night. He'd already stolen my home and my name. If the law and the press could put his mask on a table and pry it off, maybe the scales would tip back a little toward the people he'd hurt. The first step was admitting I couldn't do it alone. The small-town version of justice, gossip, angry letters, a sheriff's badge held up in a parking lot, had failed me. My brother had dressed every lie in paperwork and language that sounded official. I needed someone who could read between the legalese and the shined shoes, someone with access to records and an understanding of how to make a story matter. I thought of Olivia Sanders. Olivia wasn't just any reporter. She'd written a piece out of Portland years earlier that had made a senator's aide resign and a small-time developer rethink his ethics. She had a nose for rot, and she didn't care which side of the river the rot came from. I'd read her articles when I still trusted newspapers to do the right thing, and I'd kept them tucked into a folder on my shelf. She'd also, by some stroke of luck, grown up not far from Maple Ridge. She knew the landscape. She knew how to talk to people who were wary of strangers in suits, and more importantly, she knew how to turn documents and witness accounts into something a court of public opinion could chew on. I called her on a wet Tuesday evening, my hands still smelling like varnish. I told her to meet me at the diner, somewhere public where the coffee was strong and the booths were thin on pretense. She came early, orange scarf tucked tight, notebook already open. When I started to talk, I watched her face change from polite curiosity to the calm attention of someone who smelled a story and knew it could be dangerous. "You have to understand," I told her. "I'm not some conspiracy lunatic. I have receipts, emails, messages, signed documents, and I know where the cracks are in his story." I slid copies across the table. They were rough photocopies I'd made in secret. Emails where Ethan promised returns to investors, invoices that didn't match up to deliveries, a transfer that pointed to a shell account he controlled. I'd kept everything because after being burned once by a handshake and a grin, I'd learned the only armor is records. Olivia read without interrupting, the kind of silence that made the whole diner feel like a courtroom. When she finally looked up, she didn't smile or frown. She asked one question that made my teeth ache. "Why trust me?" "Because I can't trust anyone else," I said. "And because I think you'll do it right," which was the truth. I'd seen the way she followed a trail before. She didn't sensationalize. She mapped the facts. If anyone could turn my scraps into a case the rest of the world would see, it was her. She agreed to look. Not with the rush of a crusader, but with the methodical patience of someone who knows where the bones are buried. "We'll move slow," she told me. "If this is half as clean as you say it will stand. If not, we don't run until it does." Her voice was a narrow lane of certainty. It told me she knew the stakes. A false claim could ruin me further, and a premature expose could tip Ethan off. We both understood secrecy would be the difference between shame and vindication. So we began to gather. I dug through old hard drives and shoeboxes of paperwork I'd shoved into the barn when it felt like the only thing left to do was hold on to the past. I found email threads where Ethan asked for signatures and invoices and, in one ugly exchange, told an investor how James prefers to play the humble card. It makes closing easier. I found bank transfers with names I didn't recognize and companies registered in other states with shell addresses. I saved screenshots of messages where he promised returns that couldn't possibly come from the work we were doing. Most of all, I'd kept the signed papers, the ones I'd been foolish enough to sign, and the versions of them I'd photocopied before the lawyers took the originals. Those slightly altered copies were small things, but you could see the fingerprints of forgery if you looked close. Mismatched ink on signatures, different typefaces where documents had been stitched together, dates that didn't line up. Olivia moved like a dog at a scent. She contacted a friend at a legal aid nonprofit who specialized in white-collar fraud and asked about the common signs of paperwork manipulation. She called a former bank investigator who lived 2 hours away and had once traced a laundering scheme through 3 countries. They agreed to look at a few of the documents quietly off the record. I felt like a man in a mole tunnel, crawling closer to daylight but still underground. We also quietly spoke to people who'd been involved. That part was delicate. Investors are embarrassed when they are duped. They hide the fact as if shame can erase loss. Olivia had a way of talking to them, so they lowered their guard. Patient, direct, never accusatory. One by one, they opened up. A businessman in Vancouver who'd wired a significant sum admitted he'd been told the money would secure permits. A retired teacher from Salem, careful with her words, said she'd signed because Ethan had shown her what looked like Dad's old way of signing things. The same slanted loop on the J that had always been my father's. When we compared his signature on the forged papers to the ledger pages Dad used to keep, the differences screamed. The flourishes were wrong. The weighting of the pen strokes inconsistent. The teacher hadn't realized she'd been used. She'd thought she was preserving a family legacy. The guilt in her voice was worse than any anger. We mapped out his trail. A company created 3 states away with an address that was a mailbox at a shipping center. Design contracts that promised deliverables he never made. Loans taken out with collateral that never existed. The deeper we dug, the more the pattern looked like a spider web. Sticky where it mattered. Designed to catch desperate people who wanted to believe. There were nights I sat in the cheap motel Olivia insisted I use. She said the shed and diner had too many ears. Running my fingers over a printout and picturing Ethan's easy grin. It's a strange mix, grief and calculation. I remembered him as a boy pushing through the creek with a tin can tied to a string, laughing at nothing. And then I pictured him in a courthouse looking at the ceiling as someone read charges. Part of me wanted to give up the idea of bringing him down. Another darker part wanted him to know the cold exactly as I had felt it the night my land was signed away. We moved carefully. Olivia knew how to create a narrative that would stand up under scrutiny. Corroboration, paper trails, witness statements, and public records. She wrote questions that made investors feel safe enough to talk, and she dug public records with the patience of an archaeologist. We checked property registries, cross-referenced company filings, pulled copies of loan agreements, and tracked transactions through accounts that had been set up under layers of corporate names. When we found forged signatures, we had them examined by a handwriting expert she trusted. The expert provided a measured, technical opinion, not the kind of melodrama you see on TV, but dry, precise testimony that a court could rely on. But this wasn't just a matter of paperwork. There was also the matter of reputation, of stones already thrown. I had to be careful that Olivia and I didn't become the loud voices in a town that had already decided what it thought. We had to rebuild the truth the way I'd rebuilt furniture, slowly, each joint fitting into the next until the whole held together. We took precautions. Olivia agreed not to publish until we had rock-solid corroboration. I stopped going to places where Ethan might hear me speak to friends. When people asked what I was doing, I'd shrug and say I was trying to work, trying to scrape by. Curiosity can be poisonous in a small town. Rumor travels in the dark. And I didn't want him to feel the warm glow of victory until the curtain was pulled. There were moments of triumph that felt small but enormous. A county clerk found a record of a company name that matched an account Ethan was using. Only the registered address was a mailbox. A contractor in Portland admitted he'd been hired by a company that later claimed He never sent invoices. Those invoices matched the dates Ethan had used in emails. Olivia found a bank transfer where the intermediary account had been flagged in a previous fraud investigation. Each piece of confirmation was a nail driven into a larger frame. The cases weren't just about proving Ethan lied to me. They were about showing a pattern of behavior that had hurt many. It's important to say, I never wanted the plan to be about vengeance for vengeance's sake. I wanted accountability. I wanted the people he'd conned to be made whole if possible. I wanted the record set straight so towns like Maple Ridge might think twice before swallowing the next smooth promise. That moral weight kept me steady when anger threatened to make me reckless. We even considered legal routes. Olivia's contacts put us in touch with a public prosecutor who'd worked on similar cases. He advised restraint at first. Build the civil case, get the witnesses, make the forgeries undeniable. Criminal cases take time and patience, and prosecutors can only move when the evidence meets certain thresholds. Olivia's reporting would add public pressure, but we knew the press could also complicate legal strategy, so we folded that into our timing. Our aim was surgical: expose the pattern, gather witnesses, and present an airtight case so the law could do its work without stumbling on the tripping wires of publicity. There were nights I wanted to storm Ethan's house, shout until my throat bled, throw the photocopies at him and watch his facade crumble. But the plan required better steel. Fury without discipline is a kind of surrender, so I held on to the quiet. I worked in the rented shed, my hands steady, my mind storing away each small victory. I didn't sleep well, but I slept deeper. Because for the first time since the fall, I had a path that might lead somewhere other than more loss. We gave the plan a name that felt blunt and correct: Expose the Mask. It wasn't poetic, but it was honest. The mask was everything Ethan showed the world: charm, promises, polish. Underneath was a mess of forged papers and bought silence. We would pry that mask off with facts and witnesses, and we would do it without fanfare. Olivia would write when the time was right. The prosecutor would act when the case met his standards. And I would keep building. Porches, tables, fences, each finished piece a quiet signal that I was still the man I'd always been. The final phase was the hardest, waiting until every thread was in place. We'd arranged for Olivia to meet 2 investors who'd been willing to go on record. We had the handwriting expert's letter in hand. We'd traced the shell company to a mailbox and had the utility records that proved no one ever lived at that address. We'd collected emails where Ethan promised returns he couldn't deliver. We had witnesses who said they'd been shown forged paperwork using Dad's name. Every part of the puzzle fit, but we needed the right sequence. Publish too soon, and the story would crumble under his legal team's crosshairs. Wait too long and he might slip away, move funds, erase the trail. There were moments of doubt, nights when I wondered whether this whole thing had become more about me than the truth. But then someone would call and tell me they'd seen a neighbor who'd been swindled quietly crying in their kitchen, and my resolve would harden. This was for them too, for the farmer who'd lost his savings, for the retired teacher who'd signed because she thought she was helping preserve a family legacy, for every person Ethan had lied to with a smile. So we kept to our plan. We moved like people who knew their next step and chose it. We didn't gloat. We didn't threaten. We collected, corroborated, and connected. And in the quiet between one small victory and the next, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Not peace exactly, but the steadying warmth of a man who'd found a way to fight without losing himself. Expose the Mask wasn't just revenge. It was reclamation. It was an insistence on truth in a world that had tried to teach me that only noise and suits mattered. And as the last pieces fell into place, a witness willing to testify, a paper trail that could withstand cross-examination, a journalist who knew how to tell it clean, I looked at the photograph of Dad I kept in my pocket and said quietly, "This is for you." That morning, or that cold, clear Friday morning, but unfelt like any other at first. The sky over Maple Ridge was pale gold, the kind of color that made the mist rise slow from the pines. I remember standing by my porch, the wood still smelling fresh from last week's varnish, a mug of black coffee warming my hands. The world was still, peaceful. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could start breathing easy again. Then my phone buzzed. It was Olivia. Just one line, "It's happening." A chill ran through me. I set the mug down and walked to the edge of my porch, watching the sunlight spill across the gravel road that led to town. Somewhere down that road, the man who'd ruined me, my brother, was about to face everything he thought he'd buried. The sheriff's convoy reached his mansion at 9:14 a.m. sharp. I wasn't there, but I saw the photos later. The same red and blue lights that once flashed outside my workshop now danced across Ethan's front lawn. Irony, they say, has a cruel sense of humor. The sheriff, a man who'd barely met my eyes years ago when he took away my tools, stepped out of his cruiser with a different weight in his stride. He'd seen the evidence. Olivia's article had hit the Portland papers that very morning. Local developer exposed in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Ethan Cole's name was printed in bold letters right beneath the headline. Every lie, every forgery, every deal soaked in deceit. It was all there for the world to see. Neighbors gathered at the edge of his gated driveway, whispering the way they once whispered about me. The same mouths that had called me a thief now murmured in disbelief about him. I imagined their faces. The same old folks from the diner, the ones who once avoided my eyes. Now they couldn't look away from his fall. Ethan opened the door in his silk robe, his usual smirk gone. The man who once looked untouchable stood barefoot on the marble steps, blinking against the morning light like a cornered animal. The sheriff read him his rights. Calm, steady, official. The words cut through the air like the crack of an axe. Ethan Cole, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. Those three words, fraud, forgery, embezzlement, had haunted me for years. I'd tasted their poison, lived beneath their shadow, and now, finally, they belonged to the one who deserved them. The news spread faster than wildfire. Within an hour, half the town had seen the article. Within a day, investors who'd once shaken Ethan's hand were filing lawsuits. Within a week, his company, Cole Developments LLC, was officially bankrupt. They seized his mansion first. The same mansion where he'd thrown parties for politicians and bankers. They took the luxury cars next, lined them up like trophies of arrogance stripped bare. Reporters swarmed his driveway, their cameras flashing as Ethan tried to hide behind sunglasses that couldn't disguise his shame. And yet, I didn't celebrate. I didn't drive past his house to gloat or raise a glass at the bar. Instead, I stayed where I'd rebuilt my life, on my porch, overlooking the same land where Dad used to work, now cleared and steady again. My hands, scarred from years of labor, wrapped around that same chipped coffee mug. I watched the sunlight creep over the ridge, painting the world gold again. I thought about Ethan, not the man in the headlines, not the criminal in handcuffs, but the boy who used to race me through the woods, the brother who once carved our initials into the old oak tree. Somewhere along the way, greed had rotted whatever was good in him. And in that silence, I realized something deeper than victory. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't roar or demand applause. It arrives softly like morning light after a long storm. The town changed too. People stopped crossing the street to avoid me. Old clients returned one by one, asking if I was taking orders again. Even the sheriff, the same man who once boxed up my life as evidence, came by to shake my hand. He didn't say much, just, "Sorry it took so long, James." I nodded. There wasn't much else to say. Olivia's article won an award months later. She sent me a copy of the paper framed in oak. My work, her words. At the bottom, she'd written a note. Truth always finds its way home. When I hung it in my workshop, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real peace. Ethan's downfall didn't make me rich again. It didn't bring back the years I lost or the scars I carried, but it gave me something far more valuable. My name, my dignity, and the quiet knowledge that honesty, no matter how buried, always rises back to the surface. As the sun climbed higher that day, the light hit my porch just right, and I could almost hear Dad's voice in the wind. Low, steady, proud. "You did good, son." And for the first time since it all began, I finally believed him. The letter came in a plain white envelope. No return address, just my name scrawled across the front in handwriting I'd known my whole life. The same crooked letters Ethan used back when we were kids, carving our names into tree trunks and tool handles. I stared at it for a long while before opening it. It had been months since the arrest. Maple Ridge had gone quiet again, settling back into its old rhythm. The hum of saws, the creak of porches, the distant bark of dogs at dusk. People had stopped whispering when I walked by. The stares were gone. replaced by nods of respect and quiet apologies that came too late to matter. Life had, in its strange way, leveled out. So when I unfolded that letter, I didn't know what to expect. "You won, Jimmy. Hope you're happy." That was all it said. 10 words. No apology, no explanation, no brotherly warmth, just a cold acknowledgement from a man who used to be my best friend. I sat there for a while holding that letter, waiting to feel something. Satisfaction, relief, justice. But there was nothing. No fire, no triumph. Just a strange emptiness that felt like the quiet after a storm. I wasn't happy. I wasn't sad either. I was free. That's when it hit me. Revenge doesn't heal you. It doesn't fix what's been broken. It just closes the door that needed closing so you can finally walk away without looking back. I didn't write Ethan back. There was nothing left to say. He'd made his choices, and I'd finally learned to stop bleeding for someone who never cared if I lived or drowned. But in my heart, I did something harder than revenge. I forgave him, not for him, for me. Because hate, I realized, is a slow poison. You think it's burning someone else, but it's only corroding you from the inside. I'd carried that weight for too long. The anger, the betrayal, the endless replay of everything he took from me. Forgiving him wasn't about excusing what he did. It was about freeing myself from the grip of his shadow. So I let it go. Day by day, I started rebuilding the land. Not for money, not for reputation, but for peace. I bought back the old property piece by piece, just as Dad had once built it with his calloused hands and quiet pride. The workshop rose again, not grand or fancy, but honest. Beams of oak, sturdy walls, sunlight streaming through windows I built myself. The first thing I made wasn't a table or a chair. It was a wooden sign. I carved it slow, steady, careful with every stroke. Cole's Workshop, built on truth. It hangs right out front now, where the road bends and the wind carries the smell of pine and sawdust. Folks drive by, slow down, and smile. Sometimes they stop to watch me work, and every now and then, a few of the local kids wander in, curious, wide-eyed, asking if I can teach them something simple. So I do. I show them how to hold the chisel right, how to listen to the grain of the wood before cutting, how patience makes beauty. They laugh, mess up, start over, and I see myself in them. Not the man broken by betrayal, but the boy who once believed in good work and honest hands. One afternoon, a little girl, maybe 8 or 9, carved her initials into a small block of oak. She looked up at me with big brown eyes and asked, "Mr. Cole, is your brother coming to help you build this place someday?" For a moment I froze. The question hit deeper than she could have known. But then I smiled. Not the bitter kind, just a quiet, knowing one. "No," I said gently. "Not this time." She frowned, confused. "But he's your family, right?" I knelt down beside her, running my thumb over the grain of the wood, feeling its rough edges smooth beneath my skin. Then I said, "Blood might start the story, kiddo, but it doesn't have to end it. Because that's the truth I'd learned. Family isn't always who shares your blood. It's who stands beside you when your world burns down and helps you rebuild from ashes." Martha still stops by sometimes with pie, saying the porch I built for her never creaks, no matter how hard the wind blows. Olivia sends Christmas cards with handwritten notes about new stories she's chasing. Even the sheriff came one morning with a cup of coffee, helped me fix the fence without saying much. Those people, the ones who stayed, who believed, who showed up, they became my family. And every evening, when the sun sets behind the hills and the smell of sawdust clings to my clothes, I sit on the porch with my coffee and look out over the land. It's peaceful again. Not perfect, but honest. I still think of Ethan sometimes. Wonder where he'll go when he gets out, if he'll ever learn what truth costs or if greed has buried that lesson too deep. But those thoughts fade like echoes now. They don't hurt anymore. They just remind me how far I've come. Maybe someday he'll write again. Maybe he won't. Either way, I'll be here in the workshop, shaping wood, shaping life, building something that lasts. Because in the end, I didn't win by destroying him, I won by rebuilding myself, and that, I realized, is the truest kind of revenge, peace that no one can steal. I learned something in the ruins of it all, something that no book, no sermon, no wise man ever taught me. I learned that betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the people you'd take a bullet for, and that's why it cuts so deep, because when it comes from love, it's not just your trust that breaks, It's the part of your soul that believed love was unshakable. When Ethan betrayed me, it wasn't just business papers or land deeds he stole. He stole years of shared laughter, memories of muddy boots and late-night talks in the old barn. He took the image I had of him, the brother who once stood by my side through childhood storms, and replaced it with a stranger wearing his face. And for a long time, that loss hurt more than the lies, more than the money, more than the humiliation. It hurt because I loved him. But here's what I also learned. Truth doesn't shout. It doesn't beg to be heard. It waits, quietly, patiently, like water carving through stone. It takes time, but in the end it wins. Always. I used to think justice had to be loud like thunder, something you could see and hear, something that would shake the ground. But justice, I found, often arrives in silence. It's the moment when you stop needing to prove yourself, when you stop fighting to be believed, when you wake up one morning and realize the weight you've carried is gone, not because someone lifted it, but because you finally set it down. Ethan's lies once buried me. But from under all that wreckage, I found something stronger than revenge. Resilience. The kind that doesn't come from anger, but from acceptance. The kind that grows quietly like wild grass reclaiming scorched earth. There were nights when I wanted to see him suffer, when I wanted him to feel the same humiliation I felt, the shame of being called a liar, a fraud, a thief. But revenge, I realized, is a hunger that never fills. You feed it once and it keeps coming back emptier than before. What truly fills you, what truly heals, is peace. Peace isn't soft. It's not weakness. Peace is strength in its purest form. The courage to let go when every bone in your body wants to hold on. The courage to forgive when forgiveness feels impossible. The courage to stand on the same ground that was once taken from you and say, I'm still here. That's what I learned. That's what truth gave me. Ethan's betrayal built walls around me at first. Walls of anger, mistrust, bitterness. But over time, those same walls became the foundation I rebuilt my life upon. I stopped asking why he did it. I stopped trying to understand how blood could turn cold. Some questions aren't meant to be answered, only survived. And survive I did. I learned that the people who break you don't get to define you. What defines you is what you build after the breaking. The scars don't vanish, they stay. But they remind you of where you've been, what you've endured, and who you've become. They tell the story of a man who refused to stay broken. Now when I look at my hands, rough, scarred, aged, I see the hands of a man who has built his life twice. Once from love, and once from loss. And it's the second time that truly made me who I am. So if you're listening to this, if someone's betrayed you, shattered your trust, or left you standing in the ruins of what you thought would last forever, listen closely. Don't chase revenge. Don't waste your days trying to make them pay. That path never ends. It only leads you back to your own pain. Chase peace instead. Chase the quiet mornings, the honest work, the people who stayed. Chase the small victories that remind you that you're still alive, still capable of joy, still capable of truth. Because here's the thing about betrayal. It may break you, but it also clears the ground for something new to grow. And if you keep building, keep walking, keep believing in your own light, one day you'll stand so tall that the shadows of the past won't even touch your feet. When you rise again, not in anger, but in calm, that's when their downfall becomes inevitable. Because nothing destroys a liar faster than the truth of the person they tried to bury still standing. Still breathing, still building. That's what I learned. Betrayal burns, but it also refines. Loss hurts, but it also reveals. And truth, quiet, patient, and steady, it always finds its way home. So I live now by one simple creed. Let them have their lies. I'll keep my truth. And that truth, like the workshop I rebuilt, will stand longer than any empire built on deceit.